everyone, and welcome to Champion Briefs News for Thursday, November 14th, 2014. I'm Joe Russell, and this week's been busy, so let's get to the news. Starting off with the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, where the New York Times reported on November 9th, 2014, that the leader of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria could have been injured this past week. In fact, Iraqi officials announced this past Monday that it was believed that in airstrikes over the weekend, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, could have been injured in an airstrike. Now, the strike was concentrated in the city of Qam, which is in Anbar province in Iraq, which was believed to be a stronghold for the ISIS movement in the first place. Now, the Pentagon has refused to confirm or deny these reports, but this could be seen as a sign that airstrikes are being successful. On the other hand, if the Iraqi government is providing misinformation, that may also be an interesting indicator as to how desperate the Iraqi army may be for some good news. So this is definitely something to watch going forward to see if it ends up being confirmed by the Pentagon and we actually ended up injuring al-Baghdadi in this airstrike, which would be incredibly impressive for the United States and proof that the U.S. airstrikes are being successful. Or it could be an indication that something's going on with the Iraqi government if we can't confirm this. And it is important that then the question should be begged, is there any reason that the Iraqi government would have better intelligence capabilities than the United States to be able to make this determination when the United States can't? So this is something to watch going forward to see, because it could indicate either great success for the United States or an interesting state, or it'll indicate that the Iraqi government is in an interesting position right now. Speaking of U.S. opinions towards the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and how well the United States thinks the fight's going, there have been some indicators from the president this past week that things may not be going as great as it seems to be and as the Iraqi government appears to be leading Western media to believe. CNN reported on November 7th, 2014, that President Obama announced that he's going to send another 1,500 troops into Iraq to try and train and arm both Iraqi and Kurdish forces. Now, that alone seems to be a pretty stark indicator, because that will increase almost double the number of total U.S. troops that are in the country. That in and of itself isn't a problem, but the fact that the president promised that he would limit the number of American troops that would be sent into Iraq when we originally got involved with fighting the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria indicates that if the president is willing to break that promise and is willing to send almost twice as many troops as are already in Iraq into Iraq now, that it's interesting that the situation on the ground may have changed to the point where the president believes that a change in strategy needs to be made. Now, these troops are going to be sent as advisors. They still aren't going to be fighting ISIS or fighting on the ground, but it'll be advisors, not boots on the ground, and they will be moved not only to Baghdad, where the majority of U.S. advisors are right now, but also many of them will be moved into Anbar province, which is the Sunni territory, which is currently under ISIS control, and like we just mentioned, it's actually considered a very strong ISIS stronghold. Interesting note, during the Iraq War, sending U.S. troops into Anbar province during the surge of 2007-2008 was actually what ended up stabilizing Iraq as a whole and guaranteeing that the United States could eventually leave the region. So if U.S. troops are able to do this same thing again in Anbar province, help the Iraqi government to stabilize the region, that could be a good sign for the United States going forward and indicate that the United States is in fact actually making progress towards defeating ISIS. So there are a few questions to be asked based on these recent moves by President Obama and the moves of the Iraqi government in announcing that Baghdadi had been injured. First, is this a military creep by President Obama? Is this an attempt by President Obama to slowly but surely increase the number of troops that are actually in Iraq? Which is an interesting question. President Obama is attempting to do this in a LBJ Vietnam-style creep into Iraq. This could be problematic for the United States going forward because it may indicate that President Obama's end goal is to actually have several thousand troops, American troops, in Iraq fighting ISIS alongside Iraqi soldiers, which would again indicate that President Obama's initial strategy of trusting the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military, the Kurdish military, and the Free Syrian Army to fight ISIS, it may indicate that that strategy is now failing, which would be problematic for the United States going forward. But also, it's interesting to note that the funding for these troops is something that's also way up in the air. You'll remember there was a midterm election in which the control of the Senate flipped, which means that it'll be much less hospitable towards President Obama. but given that both Republican leaders and Democratic leaders believe that ISIS is a very clear threat, the likelihood that funding gets approved isn't completely gone. But it'll be interesting to see what happens in that political debate going forward, whether or not Republicans decide to support President Obama for getting tougher on ISIS in this most recent move, or whether they criticize him for not having a clear enough strategy at the onset of engaging with ISIS. It'll be interesting to see where the debate goes, because Republicans can pretty easily make both of those arguments. Finally, though, is this a sign, finally, that airstrikes aren't enough? Even if Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was injured this past week, if ISIS can't be eliminated simply by airstrikes, if the Iraqi army, the Kurdish Peshmerga, and the Free Syrian Army are proving not to be strong enough to be able to actually defeat ISIS, this could be a concession by President Obama that airstrikes by the United States and relying on these regional fighters aren't enough, that U.S. troops are actually necessary. And if he's reached that realization, that may mean that in the long term, the U.S. will see more and more troops being sent to Iraq, and even if they are only in an advisory role, to some extent, once you have so many troops in the country, it's inevitable that they're going to engage in some kind of combat. Finally, though, when we're talking about ISIS, the last thing to note is Reuters reported on November 6, 2014, that the Syrian government has actually made several advances in recent weeks. Now, you'll remember President Obama promised to work with the Free Syrian Army with Iraqi and Kurdish forces, but promised specifically to not work with the Syrian government, which is interesting. Reuters explains that the Syrian government actually retook the Sha'ar gas fields in central Syria. This is one of the oil fields that ISIS had controlled previously and was using to get money for lots of their operations, as we talked about in previous episodes. This is interesting then, because it may indicate that while the United States and while U.S. allies are struggling to fight against ISIS, it appears that the Syrian government is gaining ground. And this really illustrates the paradox of President Obama's strategy. Because when you think about this battle going on between the Syrian government and ISIS, it really is considered a lose-lose battle for the United States. Either Syria wins the battle, they retake the oil field, and they're able to use those revenues to, again, fight against the Syrian rebels, or ISIS wins, they control those revenues, and they use that to try and fight against the Iraqi government. Either way, somebody's getting control of these oil fields that the United States doesn't like, and that runs contrary to the U.S. strategy. But if which means then that the United States really can't view both of these as equal enemies. The U.S. really has to consider to some extent whether it's ISIS or Assad, that the U.S. is more concerned about holding these oil fields and having power. Especially if the Syrian army's on the move, the United States will have to decide very quickly. Are they going to lend airstrikes to try and help defeat ISIS, or are they going to risk ISIS actually defeating Assad's forces, but then ISIS also gaining territory as well? This is a huge paradox that's exemplified in this one oil field, but this definitely won't be the last time that ISIS and Assad's troops face off head to head, and that when one of them wins, and then regardless of who wins in any of those battles, the U.S. may end up coming out worse off. These are interesting issues to think about going forward, especially when the president begins to as the president is altering his ISIS strategy every day as we speak. So definitely keep up to date with ISIS. As we've seen for the past few months, there's almost undoubtedly news that comes out about the region every day. A second major news story from this week comes out of China, where President Obama has been this past week attending an Asia-Pacific summit. And there are a few key pieces of news that came out of China this past week. First, the New York Times reports on November 12, 2014, that while President Obama was in China, Chinese President Xi Jinping won approval from 21 Asia-Pacific nations to study the formation of a free trade zone, which would be led by China. Essentially, this free trade zone, which is called the Free Trade Area of Asia-Pacific, would be an alternative to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Obama and the United States have been advocating for, which is a free trade alliance between the United States and many other Southeast Asian nations, but not China. China has then countered against this Trans-Pacific Partnership by announcing really a free trade deal of their own that includes most of the same countries, but not the United States. This really may indicate to the United States that there is a growing rivalry with China, and that the Trans-Pacific Partnership could be increasingly difficult to get past and to get allies for going forward. And it also indicates that if the Trans-Pacific Partnership is ratified, that if the U.S. does establish this free trade bloc, they really risk losing relations with China, because if China is now making it very clear that they're opposed to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it could make it much harder for the United States to maintain the same level of diplomatic accord with China that we currently have, if the U.S. also builds a trade agreement with countries who China wants to have a trade agreement with while excluding China. So these will be interesting issues to watch going forward. And of course, in all of this, we should remember President Obama wants to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership passed. He's going to have to get it ratified by the Senate. This is an interesting debate. Democrats weren't so willing to give President Obama the ability to easily get treaties passed through the Senate, but Republicans may be willing to differ on that. That'll be an interesting political distinction and potentially an area for bipartisan cooperation between Republicans and the president going forward. Watching these trade deals will be super interesting and definitely not only have domestic political consequences for the president and Republicans when it comes to bipartisanship, but could have major geopolitical implications as well. Also with the China summit this past week, China agreed to eliminate China and the United States actually worked together to reach a new free trade deal, at least when it came to some things. China agreed to eliminate tariffs on certain IT products coming out of the United States, including video game consoles, computer software, medical equipment, and semiconductors. This is largely viewed to be able to open the door towards a new World Trade Organization treaty that will allow for free trade on these products throughout all countries, because if the United States and China, easily the WTO's top two members, are willing to agree on an issue of this magnitude, it's much more likely that the WTO will be able to pass an amendment to its current treaties to allow for these devices to be traded globally. So here we really have an interesting contradiction between the United States and China. At this same trade summit, President Obama and Xi Jinping were able to both sign a free trade deal and disagree about a different free trade deal. This really illustrates how much of a rival and an ally China is to the United States, indicating how both countries realize they need to trade more with each other, but at the same time have their own economic interest, and each other can actually stand in each other's way going forward. This is, again, an interesting paradox, but again, one where the president needs to think back to Congress. Will Congress be willing to approve this new deal with China, and will the president be able to get authority for future deals by working with Congress, Republican Congress, going forward? Finally, in the final deal that was announced between the president and Xi Jinping and China was a climate change deal as well. The New York Times reports on November 11th, 2014, that the U.S. and China agreed to a climate change deal which would have new targets for both the United States and China. This includes the first ever commitment by China to stop emissions from growing by the year 2030. And it would require to get 20% of its energy from clean energy sources by the year 2030 as well. This is a revolutionary deal because it's the first time China has ever agreed to, at some point, to agree to a peak in its amount of carbon emissions and then try and reduce them. Even if that is 15, 20 years down the road, it's significant that China agreed to do this in the first place. On the United States end, the U.S. has to reduce its emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025 than it did in 2005. So based on 2005 pollution levels, the United States needs to reduce its emissions by about 25% of that by the year 2025. The United States appears to be in general on track to do that, and that's definitely a doable goal, although it will require the U.S. to take more aggressive carbon mitigation strategies going forward, and that's something President Obama appears to be likely to do in his final 2 years in office. We'll talk about that a little more later. But again, this deal indicates a few things. First, does this indicate how powerful Xi Jinping might be actually within the Chinese government? If he's able to push through a climate deal in China, one that's viewed as largely unpopular both in the Communist Party and with the majority of businesses in China, it may indicate just how much power, just how much loyalty this new Chinese president has that none of his predecessors did. Also, remember, he's only been in office for a little over 2 years, so the fact that he's able to make this much progress with the United States in a one-week summit probably indicates that there's something new with the leadership in China as opposed to the leadership in the United States. And if China has a much stronger, more aggressive leader, that might be a good thing for now, but it could indicate problems as time goes on. Secondly, it'll be interesting to see if President Obama is able to actually make sure the United States is able to meet these carbon goals, and it'll be interesting to see what his predecessors or what his successors do as well, given that President Obama is only in office for 2 more years, and China has asked the United States to make this hard commitment. If the U.S. fails its commitment and China meets its own, that could be an interesting change in the dynamic of the relationship between the United States and China. The U.S. definitely has strong incentives to try and meet those goals, both to hold China accountable, but not to get on China's bad side either. Finally, an interesting thing to note is this will probably also increase the chance of a global climate change treaty to come out of the 2015 climate change summit that's being held in France again next year. So if that summit, it was largely believed that the United States would be dragging its heels, largely because countries like China and Japan would also be dragging their heels. But if the US and China are coming out united, both saying that they need to do more to prevent climate change and to mitigate their carbon emissions, it may increase the likelihood that, just like with the World Trade Organization, if these two countries can agree, they can bring the rest of the world along behind them and actually establish much more binding, much more permanent treaties that can actually reduce carbon dramatically going forward. If that's true, that's great for the world's progress when it comes to fighting climate change, when, again, the UN is releasing report after report, the new IPCC report coming out just last month, again saying that the US needs to do more to mitigate its carbon emissions, as well as the world as a whole needs to do that if they actually hope to avoid irrevocable damage from climate change. The third news story that this week comes from Russia-Ukraine. We've seen a cooling of tensions between those two countries for a brief period in September and October, but it appears that that cooling period is over. The Washington Post reports on November 7th, 2014, that a Ukrainian spokesman said this week that 32 Russian tanks entered Ukraine, along with 16 artillery and at least 30 trucks, entering the eastern parts of the country near Donetsk and Luhansk, the two major strongholds for the Russian allied rebels in the region. This is viewed by Ukraine as yet another violation of the Minsk agreement that Ukraine and the Russian allied rebels made back in September in Belarus. The fact that this alliance is being broken down again by both Russia, by the Russian aligned rebels, and by Ukraine as well may indicate that that temporary ceasefire was just that, a temporary ceasefire that's now being broken by both sides. This will be interesting, though, to see what the United States and NATO actually do going forward. The US and NATO have condemned this, saying that this is increased Russian aggression, but this doesn't necessarily indicate that there's any dramatic action that's going to be taken or additional action taken by the United States, by the European Union, by NATO to try and actually deter Russia from taking these aggressive steps. Also this week, Ukrainian rebels held an election saying that they would secede from Ukraine. It's interesting to note, though, that Russia said that the vote was not legitimate, saying that it didn't represent the whole of the people who lived in eastern Ukraine. But they said they did respect the decision, they did respect the vote, they did respect the opinion of many people in eastern Ukraine to decide to secede from Ukraine, and saying that it was a scathing condemnation of the governance that Ukraine has established. So this does indicate that there's increasing dissent, that the Russian-aligned rebels are still very present in eastern Ukraine, and that they aren't following the allegiance of the Ukrainian government. But it also indicates that Russia isn't willing to point-blank annex all of eastern Ukraine, the cities of Donetsk, Luhansk, etc., at least not yet. It'll be, again, interesting to see what happens going forward. And in response to a lot of this, John Kerry actually met with Sergei Lavrov, who's the Russian foreign minister, this past week to try and discuss all of these issues. The Washington Post reports on November 8th, 2014, that these two men actually met in Beijing, where Russia was, for the summit between Obama and Xi Jinping as well. Lavrov denied any wrongdoing, saying that Russia's movement of the tanks was fabricated by the Ukrainian government, refused to acknowledge that any of this was going on. Which, again, is interesting given that the United States and Russia are seeing these increasing tensions. Again, though, it's important to note that no specific action has been outlined by any of the major Western parties to try and combat this increased Russian aggression, if it actually does exist. Just an interesting side note, too, Mikhail Gorbachev, who's the final president of the Soviet Union, released a statement this past weekend saying that he believed that a new Cold War between the United States and Russia was brewing and would begin over the Ukraine crisis. An interesting overlay to everything that's going on between the two countries and definitely a much bigger picture to look at when it comes to the relations between those two countries. So two things to really quick think. Why is Russia willing to break the treaty? Do they believe that the United States isn't going to act? And if so, if the United States doesn't penalize Russia for breaking treaties like this going forward, does that weaken the United States' presence on the global stage? Also, if the West is provoked to get involved, does the West have the ability to get involved? Will the United States be willing to commit more troops to somewhere like Ukraine right now? And the answer to that is probably no, given that the United States is already very weary of getting involved in military conflicts, and beyond that is getting involved in a new military conflict, that being said, in the Middle East. So it's incredibly unlikely the United States, and as a result NATO, actually gets involved militarily in anything going on within the Ukraine crisis with increased Russian aggression. With that being the case, then, it could very easily reduce the ability of the United States to dictate terms to Russia and actually make the United States appear to be much weaker on the global stage than it currently is perceived. That may not be a great thing for the United States going forward, but it's interesting to ask the question, okay, the United States wants to get involved militarily in Ukraine, given that we're still fighting in Afghanistan, still fighting in Iraq yet again, does the United States even have the means to get involved in a third military conflict, especially in one where the U.S. hasn't had to have any military presence for the past 25 years at least? The United States and Russia did actually work together, though, this past weekend, as well as China, to try and find a new agreement, or to try and find consensus to find a way to reach a deal between the United States, the G7 or the G5+1, and Iran. The Washington Post reports on November 5th, 2014, that one of the biggest deadlines coming up this November is the nuclear deal, or is the deadline of November 24th, by which time the United States and the Gang of Six has to reach an agreement with the state of Iran to reduce Iran's nuclear presence going forward, to try and find a way to get Iran to commit to not militarizing or to not developing military weaponization of its nuclear material, while in return the West would then promise to remove sanctions slowly from Iran. Given that the deadline's coming up so quickly, it should be assumed that a deal is close to being reached if that deadline is actually going to be met. But interestingly, diplomats have said, at least in secret comments to various media outlets, that a deal is now possible but incredibly difficult to achieve given how little time they have left. Given that, though, it's unlikely, though, that a deal could be reached going forward if the deadline is passed or extended. In fact, John Kerry said this past week that the likelihood of reaching a deal with Iran dramatically goes down if the deadline's extended, because it gives the Iranian belief that they'll just be able to continue to build their nuclear capabilities up without any fear of repercussions from the West, or any repercussions coming about by not participating in the nuclear talks. And President Obama appears to agree with this sentiment. He's been pushing more and more these past few weeks to have better deal, or to try and get Iran to go along with this deal as well. The Wall Street Journal reported on November 6, 2014, that President Obama secretly wrote a letter to Ayatollah Ali Khamenei this past week, who's the Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, and the guy who's largely viewed as actually calling the shots within Iran. He urged him to agree on a nuclear deal going forward, and President Obama actually told Khamenei that if Iran would be willing to meet the nuclear deadline to agree with the West on a nuclear deal, the United States would be willing to cooperate with Iran to better fight ISIS in Iraq. Again, bringing a lot of these news stories we've been talking about full circle. If that actually happens to be the case, this could either be an incentive or a disincentive for Iran to work with the United States on these nuclear talks. Remember, Iran has said they don't want to work with the United States when it comes to fighting ISIS, so President Obama, by saying this, could have hurt the United States' position, or he could be reading more into Iran's actual actions and realizing that if Iran hopes to be successful in stopping ISIS, they'll need to work with the United States. It'll be interesting to see then if this proves as a greater incentive or disincentive for Iran to work with the United States going forward. But regardless, there are a ton of questions that need to be asked about this nuclear deal going forward, and a lot of questions that tie into the other topics that we've been talking about today as well. First, remember something that should be remembered for the West, and that needs to be remembered whenever you're talking about Iranian sanctions, whether that's in Congress or Extemp. Once the United States removes the sanctions, those sanctions can't just be immediately put up once again if, say, Iran breaks any nuclear deal. And that's something that the West is very conscious of. And think about it, it makes sense this way. If the United States suddenly allows all sorts of Western businesses to reinvest in Iran, which would mean building up a very physical capital in the country, building things like oil refineries, oil pumps, and shipping lanes and pipelines in Iran, the U.S. can't then go to those companies 2 years later after removing the sanctions and say, hey, never mind, Iran broke its nuclear deal, sanctions are back up. That'll prompt a backlash from all of those companies and actually destabilize the United States and the European economy as much as it will destabilize the Iranian economy. This means that once the United States takes sanctions down against Iran, they can't be put back up. And that's why these negotiations are so critical, though, because a deal with Iran has to be written so that Iran can't cheat, because there's no disincentive for Iran cheating, and that sanctions, once they're removed, can't be put back up. This may be a key sticking point in the negotiations, too, because if the West is hesitant to immediately remove sanctions from Iran, from the Iranian government as a result, because sanctions can't be put back up, this may be a disincentive for Iran to agree with the United States to actually reduce its nuclear program until they see sanctions going away. It's this positive feedback loop where you actually see neither side being willing to give any ground because of the fact that sanctions are so fragile, and the fact that they, again, once they're gone, they won't be able to be re-implemented very quickly. But then again, some questions to be thinking again, how much power does Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran, actually have? If President Obama is willing to talk to the supreme leader as opposed to the president of Iran, that may indicate that Rouhani, who was supposed to be a reformer in Iran, supposed to bring better ties around with the West, it may indicate that he actually doesn't have that much influence, that it's actually still Khamenei, the supreme leader, who's still calling all of the shots in Iran. Also interesting to see what Obama's motivations are for this. This could easily be a legacy issue for President Obama. If he can achieve peace between the United States and Iran, or actually get Iran to stop developing nuclear weapons, that would be a great feather in his presidential cap, and certainly a great exhibit at his forthcoming presidential library. So that may be an interesting motivator for President Obama to try and actually accomplish anything going forward. But also, by writing to the Supreme Leader, it could also be asked if Obama looks too desperate on the global stage. Given that the president doesn't appear to have the greatest control over the U.S. fight against ISIS, is really allowing Russia to do what it wants in Ukraine without major repercussions, if the president is also pleading with the Supreme Leader of Iran, many argue that this may make him look a little less presidential, look a little more desperate on the international stage, a little less deft with dealing with some of these issues. That's an interesting concern to be thinking about going forward. Also, are these talks going to be harder than nuclear talks with Iran, given that the United States and Russia have increased tensions? Remember, it's the 5 members of the UN Permanent Security Council plus Germany who are negotiating with Iran, so that includes China and Russia. So if the U.S. doesn't have good ties with either China or Russia going forward, or those two countries don't agree with the United States about the Iran deal, it could be harder to accomplish that deal in the end as well. Also, again, let's go back to Congress in the recent elections that were held. Republicans strongly oppose removing sanctions against Iran. And in fact, many GOP senators like McCain and Graham have actually said that they want to introduce legislation in the Senate that would also presumably pass in the House, saying that if the president strikes a deal with Iran to remove sanctions, which the president can do on his own as long as it's an agreement, not a treaty, it wouldn't have to be ratified. But Congress can pass a bill saying that the president, if he removes any sanctions, those are automatically re-implemented by Congress. In other words, the Senate could essentially do a go-around behind the president and go against the deal he works out with Iran by re-implementing sanctions that President Obama, in the deal he works out with the Iranian government, says that he's going to remove. That could again be a huge problem for the president going forward unless he's able to reach a deal with Iran very quickly before the Senate actually changes to be controlled by the Republicans. Moving out of the Middle East and that whole relationship with China and Russia now, there's also been an interesting news story developing across the Atlantic in the country of France, and that's with the French President François Hollande. The Telegraph reports on November 6, 2014, that this past week, Hollande actually appeared on national television in France, where he appeared for a 90-minute special broadcast where his ultimate goal was to convince the country that his economic policy has not been an overwhelming failure, and to convince the country that his presidency, which he still has 2.5 years left to serve, he had to try and convince the country that his presidency isn't essentially over. Hollande has seen a dramatic drop in his support in France, given that many believe his economic policy, which promised to reduce unemployment and reduce the national deficit, has done neither in the first 2 years that he's been in president. And actually, that's caused only him to have an approval rating of only 12%. 12% in France. All French voters believe only 12% of them actually support Hollande going forward, and 97% think that he has failed to kickstart the economy. These are approval ratings that rival the U.S. Congress, but for an international leader, and especially an international leader who has 2 more years left of his term to serve before standing for re-election, this may indicate a lot of weakness on the part of the French government going forward. Because if Hollande can't be taken seriously, it's going to be much harder for him to be able to work with organizations like the European Union, to work with the United States to find a deal with Iran, to be taken seriously on the global stage in general, if he doesn't have the legitimacy of his own people behind him. And given how prominent France is, not just as a permanent member of the UN Security Council and one of the chief leaders in the Eurozone and in the European Union, if they have a weakened leader, this could dramatically reduce the French presence on the global stage and potentially destabilize some of these organizations. If France has so much deficit and debt, so much unemployment, so much instability in its economy, then investors might be willing to leave that country and in fact reinvest somewhere outside of the European Union, which would mean then that Hollande's unpopularity itself could further destabilize the European Union, which is something that many leaders in that region really don't want. This will again be something interesting to watch going forward, to see what exactly happens with Francois Hollande and seeing if he's actually successful in buoying and bringing up his popularity rating, or if his low numbers are actually going to hold back the entire European Union and potentially the Western economies as a whole. The final international news story, which also borders with domestic and one that we've been talking about for the past few weeks as well, is the Ebola crisis. The Kaiser Family Foundation this week put the most recent death and infected totals at 4,950 individuals have now died of Ebola, and 13,241 have been confirmed infected by the World Health Organization. And again, many say that those numbers are likely much higher, but those are the numbers that we actually know of diagnosed cases of Ebola. And that's actually an interesting point, because the New York Times reports on November 12, 2014, that Ebola may have spread to Mali, and nobody may have realized it until just now. They explained that a clinic in Bamako, Mali, actually recently treated an elderly gentleman, an imam actually, for the Islamic faith. They treated him in a private hospital, and it was unknown for the reasons that he was having several organs were failing at the same time. So he ended up dying at that clinic, and then he was buried in Mali and transported back to his homeland. Interestingly, though, doctors, after conducting tests after he died, realized that imam was diagnosed with Ebola, but it wasn't realized at the time, which meant that none of the Ebola precautions were taken, and now over 100 individuals in Mali, both who were in the mosques where the imam was buried, as well as who worked at the hospital that he was treated at, could have been exposed to Ebola, which means that complicated contact tracing is actually now being undergone in Mali to try and figure out if the disease actually has spread to that country. And it's interesting to note this imam actually passed away over 2 weeks ago now, which means that contact tracing is extraordinarily difficult and that it is very possible that Ebola could be in the country. This is just an illustration not only of how Ebola can spread so easily and undetected, but also how it's so hard for the World Health Organization to have very accurate totals of exactly how many people have died of Ebola, how many people are infected with Ebola at any one time. But speaking of Ebola infections, as of this past week, there's no more Ebola in the United States. ABC News reported on November 10th, 2014, that Craig Spencer, who was the doctor in New York City who had been infected with Ebola, was released from Bellevue Hospital pronounced Ebola-free. And on another side note, Casey Hickox, who was the nurse who had been quarantined by Chris Christie for potentially having Ebola when she came back from West Africa, her quarantine also expired, meaning that she now definitively also doesn't have Ebola. Meaning that the United States and the panic for Ebola in the United States can subside slightly, although it's likely going forward, or it's not unlikely going forward, that someone else in the United States could return from West Africa who is again infected with Ebola, meaning that the risk certainly remains high in the United States, but there isn't any imminent threat like the United States feared there were a few weeks ago. Moving towards more domestic news at this point, the unemployment numbers for October came out this past week. The Wall Street Journal reported on November 7, 2014, that in October, the U.S. economy added 214,000 jobs, which was about 20,000 fewer jobs than were expected to be added to the economy. Nonetheless, the unemployment rate did drop to 5.8%. But the interesting note in all of these numbers is that the labor force participation rate remains startlingly low. The rate was actually at 62.8%, and that's interesting because that means that of all of the potential workers in the U.S. economy, so that is anybody between the ages of 16 to 65, of those people, only 62.8% of them were actually looking for work in October of 2014, which means, as several analysts have pointed out, that as the economy does better and better, it's likely that more people are actually going to decide to join the economy and to start looking for jobs. But the instant that they do that we see the other 40% or 38% of the country decide to actually begin to look for jobs in the U.S. economy again, that'll actually, because there are more people looking for work, that'll mean there are more people who are considered unemployed, which means the unemployment number could actually go up. Conversely, though, that also means that right now, even though the unemployment number is so low, that number isn't representing all of the Americans who still have just decided to not look for work right now, and as a result, they are unemployed, but because of the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually conducts those unemployment numbers, they actually can't be proven to be unemployed, given the way that the data is conducted. So, these are interesting things to be thinking about going forward, and an interesting way to contextualize the unemployment numbers. Also this past week, President Obama announced officially who he was going to nominate for Attorney General. The Washington Post reported on November 7, 2014, that President Obama has announced that he wants to nominate Loretta Lynch as the next Attorney General. She would be the first African-American woman to be nominated for the post. She's currently the U.S. Attorney in New York. She's an experienced prosecutor who has a deep relationship with the Justice Department, as well as experience in prosecuting political corruption, terrorism, and organized crime. Interestingly as well, she's also twice been confirmed by the U.S. Senate in the past when she served as a district attorney for both President Obama and for President Bill Clinton, meaning that she actually has a better chance of being confirmed than most. Senate Democrats say that they're going to allow, though, the confirmation to occur at the beginning of the 114th Congress, which means that she will be confirmed by a Republican Congress and not a Democratic Congress. Interestingly as well, this prompted no outcry from the GOP, indicating that the likelihood that she will be confirmed actually has gone up pretty dramatically. Politico reports on November 10, 2014, though, that the GOP strategy for Lynch's nomination appears to be less about her personally and her ability to be Attorney General, but will focus more broadly on the rule of law and specifically the role that executive orders play in the U.S. Constitution. So much of her confirmation could actually be focused on senators asking her about her opinions of President Obama's executive actions in an attempt to try and get her to trip up. The Republican justification for this will obviously be that the Attorney General needs to have a full understanding of the extent of the law. So she'll be asked to try and either approve of or disapprove of the way that President Obama has used executive orders going forward, and both of those could actually hurt her ability to get confirmed going forward. If she says that what President Obama is doing is perfectly legal, then that risks her not getting confirmed by the Senate. But if she says they're illegal, then the minute she's confirmed, Republicans will be pushing her to try and prosecute the president and reduce the amount of executive orders that are undertaken by the president. So this could be an interesting paradox that she's going to be put in as confirmation battles start in January. Speaking of the judicial system in general, there have been a few court rulings this past week. First, the New York Times reported on November 7, 2014, that the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals actually upheld a ban on gay marriage in Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee. This is the first time that any appellate court has actually said that bans on gay marriage are okay, and in the majority opinion, the justice writing the case actually said that this is an issue that should be decided by the voters and not by the courts. This, unsurprisingly, though, increases the chance and makes it now very likely that the Supreme Court will have to take up the case. The Supreme Court, you'll remember, refused to take up gay marriage cases back in the beginning of October when they were setting their docket. But they did that because there hadn't been any disagreement amongst appellate courts. Now that there has been disagreement between the courts, the Sixth Circuit disagreeing with the Fourth Circuit and the Ninth Circuit, this could actually increase the chance that the Supreme Court will have to take up the case, meaning that the Supreme Court will have to make a Roe v. Wade-like decision for gay marriage, either saying it's 100% legal in the country or it's 100% illegal in the country. This will be interesting to see then what the Supreme Court does and if they decide to actually take up the case. One case, though, that the Supreme Court did agree to take up this past week was the case King versus Burwell, which is the case that was previously heard by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., which deals with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. This specific case alleges, as was heard in the Washington, D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals most recently, what this case focuses on is it says that the subsidies that are laid out under the Affordable Care Act were only supposed to go to plans that were sold on state-based exchanges. Because when the Affordable Care Act was written, it was assumed that every state was going to create its own exchange for the insurance market. But you'll remember that almost a majority of states, in fact all but 16 states, have refused to establish their own exchanges and have instead asked the federal government to run exchanges for them. This case, though, alleges that that's illegal because the law says nowhere that subsidies can be provided on the federal exchange, only on the state-based exchanges. That's why the consensus is then that if the Supreme Court sides with the Fourth Circuit in saying that, in fact, the law does make subsidies illegal in a majority of the country, this would remove the teeth from the Affordable Care Act and make it absolutely impossible for the law to be continually enforced, because suddenly every American is required to have health insurance, but they also have to pay the high bills of insurance that aren't going to be covered by subsidies as they currently are. This could potentially destabilize the market going forward. In fact, one estimate from the Associated Press points out that if Americans lose their subsidies, right now they pay an average of $82 per month for a plan with subsidies. Without subsidies, you could be paying $346 per month for an average insurance plan. That's going to be unsustainable for many Americans, which means that how the Supreme Court rules on this could, once again, determine whether or not the Affordable Care Act is actually able to remain the law of the land going forward. It'll be, again, interesting then to see what the Supreme Court decides to do with this going forward. Finally, we've had, as we've mentioned numerous times throughout this episode, the election happened a few weeks ago and Democrats didn't fare so well. There's certainly been a lot of post-mortem analysis that's been going on in both the Democratic and Republican parties to try and determine what each party should do going forward to understanding what happened this past election. The Washington Post reported on November 6th, 2014, that Democrats have still planned to try and pass several major items while they still have control of the Senate in this upcoming lame duck session. They plan to pass bills which will revive a few expired tax breaks, and will have to pass a new resolution to avoid a government shutdown, which currently the government would shut down on December 11th unless the House and the Senate, which are still currently Democratic and Republican, can reach an agreement to extend a continuing resolution to pass a budget going forward. The Senate's also going to try and push through several presidential nominations for federal judgeships, as well as some nominations for the State Department, which means that as the Democrats get ready to hand over the gavel in the Senate, they could be ending that with some controversial appointments that Republicans may not be quick to forget when they retake the Senate in January. President Obama has also announced that he's going to be taking more executive action on his own. The first of those is going to be actually action on immigration. The New York Times reported on November 11th, 2014, that President Obama plans to act on immigration within the next 2 weeks. And they've begun to outline what exactly his immigration action is going to include. It will likely be an extension of the DACA program, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals in the United States, which is the program that President Obama signed in 2012. This new program will apply to an additional 5 million illegal immigrants who are living in the United States. The majority of those, about a little over 3.5 million, will be the parents of legal residents currently in the United States. So if parents have children who are either citizens or legal residents in the United States, President Obama's immigration action is going to also grant those parents the right to remain in the United States without the fear of deportation. Now, it's interesting to note that, as Politico notes on November 11, 2014, this is incredibly unpopular within the Republican Party. Many Republicans have already said that if the president takes dramatic action on immigration, not only will they try and undo that when they retake control of the Senate, but it'll also make working with the president much harder going forward. Interestingly, the president has said on several occasions in the past week since the election that if Republicans would be willing to pass in the House the Senate bill that was passed in 2013 by the Senate, he would be willing to not act on his own, but given that that's very unlikely to happen, he said that he has no choice but to act. The question to obviously ask is this going to be enough for the president and for the Democratic Party to make it, or to make up to Latino voters who by and large stayed home on election day and could be seen as the reason that Democrats lost in certain states, for example, the Colorado Senate race. It'll also be interesting, as some analysts have pointed out, what the Republican Party is actually able to do with its immigration position going forward. They note that there are really two camps in the GOP when it comes to immigration. There's one camp who believes that immigration is incredibly problematic in any form, the Tea Party wing that believes you should shut down the borders and not allow any immigrants to come into the country, or some version of that statement. Then there are also the more pragmatic wing of the GOP that says immigration reform is necessary, a pathway to citizenship is necessary to some extent. Interestingly, though, these two camps have been divided for many years, but if the president takes unilateral immigration action, then both of these sides can instantly unite. They can agree together that what the president has done is wrong, and that actually gives the Republicans a much more united immigration position going into 2016, which may not be what the president and what Democrats want going into those elections. President Obama's also, though, announced that he intends to act on climate change before the end of his term as well. And we already talked about the deal that he reached with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And remember also that there's an upcoming climate summit in 2015. It's going to be held in France that'll try and reach a global climate change agreement that the president has announced he really wants to take part in as well and try and find some way to get the United States to participate in such an agreement, even if it won't be ratified by the U.S. Senate. But in the next few months, the president's also going to be rolling out some major climate change action as well. In fact, Politico reports on November 11, 2014, that President Obama has been holding off on issuing final rules that have been mandated by several court rulings from 2012 to 2014. And he's now announced that he intends to roll out all of those final rules, all of these new regulations, mostly through the EPA, in the next few weeks. On December 1st, he's going to roll out new EPA limits on smog-causing ozone, which is viewed as the costliest federal regulation of all times when it comes to business. Then on December 19th, he's going to release a final rule which will clamp down on the disposal of toxic ash by many power plants. On January 1st, he's going to implement a long-debated rule prohibiting states from polluting air downwind of their neighbors. And on January 8th, he faces a deadline for issuing a final rule restricting greenhouse gas emissions for future power plants. In other words, in the next month and a half, the president could be taking dramatic action on climate change that could really alter the amount of carbon that's emitted by the United States, and again antagonize Republicans who ran for a lot of the 2014 midterms against the president's carbon strategies, saying that he is trying to conduct a war on coal. If the president, though, has the legal authority to do all these things, as he does without subject to Senate approval, it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward by the Republican Senate, and if they just decide to, if they can't stop the president from taking action in many of these things, they may instead just settle simply on political retribution, making bipartisanship harder for the president going forward. And the Republicans have certainly rolled out a clear agenda of what they hope to do in the upcoming Congress as well. That includes balancing the budget, restoring an orderly process for spending bills, revising and trying to replace, if not repeal, the Affordable Care Act, overhauling the tax code, trying to act on immigration, although they won't if President Obama takes unilateral action, passing the Keystone Pipeline, and potentially reaching trade agreements, which is the one area out of all the things I just mentioned that Republicans and Democrats may actually be able to work together on. A final note, though, it'll be interesting to see what happens in this upcoming Senate with some of the red state Democrats, people like Joe Manchin from West Virginia, Claire McCaskill from Missouri, and Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota. These are all Democrats from very red states who may be willing to work with this new Republican majority to try and find some pragmatic solutions, given that they need to try and prove to their constituents that they're more pragmatic, more willing to reach across the aisle, and more willing to work with Republicans than many of the Democratic majority right now. So it'll be interesting to see if there are a group of Democrats who are actually willing to work with Republicans going forward. Well, that's been the news for this week. Again, make sure you stay up to date on everything that goes on in this next week, and we'll see you right here next week with Champion Briefs News. Have a great night, everyone.